1897. Family photograph recovered. An expert shuddered to discover that the youngest son is hiding a secret. The humid Atlanta afternoon pressed against the windows of the Emory University archives as historian Dr. James Mitchell carefully examined a collection of 19th century photographs. His specialization in post-Civil War African-American history had brought him to this climate-controlled room, where boxes of donated materials waited to reveal their stories. James had spent 12 years studying the visual documentation of black life in the American South during the late 1800s, a period when photography was becoming more accessible, yet still expensive enough that every image represented a significant investment and intentional choice. Each photograph he handled was a window into lives that had fought to be seen, to be remembered, to claim their place in history. He reached into a box labeled Atlanta Collections 1890-1900 and withdrew a photograph protected by acid-free tissue paper. As he carefully removed the protective layer, his breath caught. The image showed a black family of 6, a father and mother, standing behind 4 children arranged by height. They were dressed formally, the parents in dark, well-maintained clothing, the children in carefully pressed shirts and dresses. The father stood with his hand on the mother's shoulder, his expression serious and dignified. The mother's face showed a mixture of pride and something else, something James couldn't immediately identify, perhaps sadness or exhaustion or the weight of unspoken knowledge. 3 of the children, 2 girls and an older boy, stood with the solemn expressions typical of Victorian-era photography, when long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. But it was the youngest child, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who made James pause. The child sat in a chair at the front of the family group, his hands folded carefully in his lap, his head tilted at a slight angle. His eyes were closed, not squinting against light, but fully closed, as if he were sleeping or lost in deep contemplation. James had seen thousands of photographs from this era. He knew the conventions, the posing techniques, the visual language of 19th century portraiture, and something about this youngest child was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly, disturbingly wrong, in a way that made the historian's instincts sharpen with attention. He placed the photograph under his scanner, adjusting the settings to capture every detail. As the high-resolution image appeared on his computer screen, James began the methodical process of examination that had served him throughout his career. He zoomed in on faces, clothing, background details, looking for the small clues that photographs accidentally or deliberately preserved. When he magnified the image of the youngest boy, his suspicion crystallized into certainty. The child's stillness wasn't the result of good posing or patient waiting. The slight discoloration around the eyes, the unnatural rigidity of the posture, the way the hands were positioned with too perfect precision, these were the hallmarks of post-mortem photography, a common practice in the Victorian era when families photographed their dead as a final memorial. But this photograph wasn't presented as a post-mortem image. It was disguised as an ordinary family portrait, with the deceased child positioned among his living family members as if he were simply another participant in the formal sitting. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with questions. Why would a family hide the fact that this was a memorial photograph? What had happened to this child? And what story lay buried in this image, waiting 122 years to be uncovered? James spent the rest of the afternoon researching the provenance of the photograph. According to the archive's records, it had been donated by a local estate sale company that had acquired materials from a house in the historic West End neighborhood of Atlanta. The donation included several boxes of photographs, letters, and documents, all dating from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He examined the back of the photograph carefully. In faded pencil, someone had written, "Family, 1897. No names, no location more specific than what the archive records provided, no indication of the photographer's studio." The lack of information was itself significant. Most formal portraits from this era included the photographer's stamp or the family's names. James contacted the estate company, hoping to learn more about the house where the materials had been found. The manager, a woman named Patricia Wells, checked her records and called him back within an hour. The property was on Ashby Street, she explained. It had been in the same family for over a century. The last resident, an elderly woman named Mrs. Dorothy Freeman, passed away last year at 96. She had no surviving children, and distant relatives asked us to handle the estate. Most of the furniture and household items went to auction, but she had specifically requested in her will that any photographs and documents be donated to a historical archive. James felt a familiar thrill of discovery. A woman who had lived nearly a century had wanted these materials preserved. She had recognized their historical importance even if she hadn't provided detailed information about them. "Did Mrs. Freeman leave any notes or documentation about the photographs?" James asked. "Not that we found," Patricia replied, "but there were boxes of letters and papers. We donated everything together. Have you looked through all the materials from that estate?" James hadn't. He had been randomly examining photographs when this particular image had caught his attention. Now he returned to the archive's catalog and requested all materials from the Dorothy Freeman estate donation. Over the next 2 days, James methodically worked through 3 additional boxes. He found letters dating from the 1890s through the 1940s, church programs, receipts, newspaper clippings, and personal documents. Many of the letters were signed by people with the surname Freeman, suggesting family correspondence preserved across generations. One letter, dated September 1897 and written in careful, educated script, made James's heart race. "Dear Sister Eliza, we received word of your terrible loss. No words can express our sorrow for what has been taken from you. We understand why you cannot speak of it openly. The photograph you described, showing him with the family as if he still breathed, is both heartbreaking and wise. They cannot erase him if his image remains. We will hold your secret in your grief. May God grant you strength." James read the letter 3 times. The writer offered condolences for a loss that couldn't be spoken about openly. The reference to a photograph showing someone as if he still breathed matched exactly what James had discovered. And the phrase, "they cannot erase him," suggested deliberate documentation in the face of forced silence. He searched through more letters, finding several references to Eliza and her family in Atlanta. One letter from 1898 mentioned Robert's continued strength despite everything, and the girls growing taller every month. These had to be the parents in the photograph, Robert and Eliza with their daughters and the son whose death they had hidden in plain sight. But why hide it? Why create a memorial photograph disguised as a family portrait? In the Victorian era, post-mortem photography was common and socially acceptable. Families openly documented their dead, especially children, as a way of preserving their memory. Unless, James realized with growing horror, the death itself was something that couldn't be openly acknowledged, unless the circumstances were too dangerous to speak about. James needed more context about Atlanta in 1897, specifically about the experiences of black families during that volatile period. He spent the following morning in Emory's main library pulling historical texts, newspapers, and academic studies about race relations in late 19th century Georgia. What he found painted a disturbing picture. The 1890s were a period of intense racial violence in the South. The brief promise of Reconstruction had collapsed, and white supremacist groups had reasserted brutal control. Black Americans who had gained property, education, and political participation during Reconstruction faced systematic campaigns of terror designed to strip away those gains. In Atlanta, specifically, 1897 was a year of particular tension. The city was rapidly industrializing, and economic competition between black and white workers created friction that white supremacists exploited. Newspapers from the era, James found them on microfilm, regularly published inflammatory articles about alleged black criminality, often completely fabricated, designed to justify violence and legal oppression. James discovered something else that made his stomach turn. In September 1897, several Atlanta newspapers had reported on what they called necessary measures taken against a criminal element in the black community. The articles were vague about details, but mentioned that order had been restored in certain neighborhoods. Reading between the lines of the racist rhetoric, James recognized these reports for what they were: coded acknowledgement of racial violence against black residents. One article, from September 14, 1896, mentioned an incident in the West End neighborhood, the same area where the Freeman family had lived. The article claimed that a young Negro had been dealt with appropriately after an unspecified transgression. No name was given, no details about what had allegedly occurred, no mention of any legal proceedings. James felt sick. This was likely what had happened to the youngest boy in the photograph. Some invented accusation, some excuse for violence, and a child had been murdered. And the family couldn't report it, couldn't seek justice, couldn't even openly mourn without risking further violence. He returned to the archive and requested access to Atlanta's historical records from 1897, birth records, death certificates, church registries, anything that might contain the family's names and confirm what had happened. The death records for black residents from that year were incomplete, a common problem James had encountered throughout his research. Many black deaths went unrecorded or were deliberately excluded from official documentation. But he found a church registry from Friendship Baptist Church, one of Atlanta's oldest black congregations, that listed members' births, marriages, and deaths. There, in the registry for September 1897, he found them. Robert Freeman, age 38, laborer. Wife, Eliza Freeman, age 36. Children, Margaret, age 13. Sarah, age 11. Robert Jr., age 9. Samuel, age 8. And below, in different ink, as if added later, a single devastating line. Samuel Freeman departed this life September 12, 1897. The Lord knows. The phrase, "the Lord knows," appeared nowhere else in the registry. It was a coded message from whoever had recorded the death, an acknowledgement that the truth of how Samuel had died was known to God, even if it couldn't be written in official records. James now had the family's names and the date of Samuel's death. He had confirmation that the youngest boy in the photograph was Samuel Freeman, that he had died just days before the newspaper's vague report about an incident in West End, and that his family had created a memorial photograph disguised as a normal family portrait. but he still needed to understand the full story. What exactly had happened to 8-year-old Samuel Freeman? Why had his family chosen this particular way to preserve his memory? And were there any descendants who might hold the answers that documents couldn't provide? Friendship. Baptist Church still stood on its original location on Mitchell Street, though the building had been renovated and expanded several times since 1897. James called ahead and spoke with the church administrator, explaining his research and asking if he could examine their historical records and speak with anyone knowledgeable about the congregation's history. The administrator, a woman named Mrs. Claudia Washington, invited him to come the following afternoon. "We take our history seriously here," she said. "This church has been a pillar of the black community in Atlanta for over 150 years. If your research honors that history respectfully, we'll help however we can." When James arrived, Mrs. Washington greeted him warmly and led him to a small office where she had already laid out several volumes of church records. "I pulled everything from the 1890s after you called," she explained. "I also asked Deacon Howard to join us. His family has been part of this congregation for 5 generations. If anyone knows the old stories, it's him." Deacon Marcus Howard was a man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that held both warmth and wariness. He shook James' hand firmly. "Mrs. Washington says you're researching the Freeman family. That's a name that carries weight in this church's history." James showed them the photograph on his laptop, explaining what he had discovered about Samuel's death being hidden in what appeared to be a normal family portrait. Both Mrs. Washington and Deacon Howard studied the image carefully, their expressions growing somber. "Lord have mercy," Deacon Howard said quietly. "I've heard stories about this photograph my whole life, but I never thought I'd actually see it." James leaned forward. "You know about this?" "Not about the photograph specifically," the deacon explained, "but about the Freeman family, yes. About what happened to little Samuel. My great-grandmother was friends with Eliza Freeman. She used to tell my grandmother, who told my mother, who told me, the stories get passed down, even when they're painful, especially when they're painful." He paused, gathering his thoughts. September 1897. Samuel Freeman was 8 years old. He was walking home from school. There was a small school for black children that the church helped run. He passed by a store owned by a white man. The man's daughter, maybe 10 or 11 years old, came out and spoke to Samuel. Just a greeting, just children being children. Deacon Howard's voice grew harder. But someone saw them talking, made up a story that Samuel had been inappropriate, had frightened the girl. None of it was true. The girl herself apparently said nothing had happened. But that didn't matter. That night, men came to the Freeman house. They took Samuel. James felt his throat tighten. What happened to him? "They beat him to death," Mrs. Washington said quietly, her eyes filled with tears. "An 8-year-old child. Beat him to death in the street while his parents were held at gunpoint, forced to watch. Then they left his body in front of the house as a warning to the whole community." The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. James struggled to process the horror of what he was hearing. The deliberate public murder of a child, the torture of forcing his parents to witness it. "The family couldn't report it," Deacon Howard continued. "Couldn't seek any kind of justice. The sheriff was sympathetic to the men who did it, maybe even involved. If Robert or Eliza had made an official complaint, they would have been killed too, and their daughters. So they buried Samuel quietly, mourned in silence, and found other ways to remember him." James understood now why the photograph was composed the way it was. It was an act of resistance and love, a refusal to let Samuel be erased, a way of documenting his existence and his place in the family, even though speaking the truth of his death could mean more violence. "The church helped them," Mrs. Washington added. "Our pastor at the time arranged for the photographer to come. It was expensive, cost them money they could barely spare, but they wanted Samuel in the photograph. They wanted proof that he had lived, that he had been loved, that he had belonged." Deacon Howard made a phone call while James sat quietly, still processing the devastating story he had just heard. After a brief conversation, the deacon looked up. "Robert and Eliza's great-great-granddaughter lives here in Atlanta. Her name is Dr. Nicole Freeman. She's a professor at Spelman College. She's willing to meet with you this evening at her home." That night, James drove to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Dr. Nicole Freeman, a woman in her late 50s with natural gray hair and her ancestors' same serious, dignified bearing, answered the door. "Come in, Dr. Mitchell. Deacon Howard told me what you've discovered." Her living room was filled with family photographs, spanning generations. James noticed immediately that many included children positioned prominently, lovingly documented, their presence celebrated. He understood now that this was a family tradition born from loss, making sure every child was seen, remembered, preserved. Nicole led him to a photograph on the mantel showing an elderly woman. "This is Dorothy Freeman, the woman whose estate those materials came from. She was my grandmother. She died last year at 96, but her mind was sharp until the very end. She used to tell me stories about our family history, about the importance of remembering." Well, since James showed Nicole the 1897 photograph on his laptop. She stared at it for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. "I've never seen this," she whispered. "Grandma Dorothy told me it existed. Told me about Samuel, but I never saw the actual photograph. There he is. There's my family. They sat together while Nicole composed herself. Then she shared what she knew from family stories passed through generations. Robert Freeman had been a skilled carpenter who owned his own small business, rare and threatening to white supremacists who wanted to keep black people economically subordinate. Eliza had been educated, could read and write, taught children in their home before the church school was established. They were exactly the kind of black family that terrified white supremacists, Nicole explained. Successful, educated, independent. Samuel's murder wasn't random violence. It was a message to my great-great-grandparents. Know your place, or we'll destroy everything you've built. She walked to a bookshelf and retrieved a small wooden box. Grandma Dorothy left this for me. She said it contained things from Eliza, things that had been passed down through the women in our family. Inside the box were several items: a pressed flower, a child's small shoe, a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon, and several pieces of paper covered in careful handwriting. Nicole handed one of the papers to James. It was a letter in Eliza's hand, dated December 1897. To my daughters and their daughters after them, remember Samuel. Remember that he was gentle and kind. Remember that he loved to sing and had a laugh that could fill a room. Remember that he did nothing wrong. Remember that his death was murder, not justice. Remember that we could not speak these truths aloud, but we found ways to preserve them. The photograph shows our family complete because he is part of us forever. Tell your children. Tell your children's children. Do not let them erase him. James read the letter 3 times, each word burning into his memory. This was why the photograph had been created the way it was, not just as a memorial for the present, but as evidence for the future, a deliberate historical record that would outlast the terror that had tried to silence the truth. There's something else, Nicole said. She handed James another paper, this one a list of names and dates. Eliza kept a record. Every black person in Atlanta who was murdered by white mobs between 1895 and 1900, she documented what the authorities refused to document. She created an archive of the dead. The list in James's hands contained 43 names, 43 black residents of Atlanta murdered in just 5 years. Men, women, and children whose deaths had gone unrecorded in official documents, unreported in white newspapers except as vague mentions of incidents or necessary measures. Beside each name, Eliza had written the date, the approximate age, and a brief note about the circumstances. Samuel Freeman, age 8, September 12, 1897, beaten to death for speaking to a white child. Thomas Wright, age 34, March 3, 1896, lynched for refusing to step off the sidewalk. Mary Jackson, age 19, July 17, 1898, killed defending her home from attack. The list went on, a litany of violence and stolen lives. Eliza had documented what no one else would, creating a historical record in the face of systematic erasure. My great-great-grandmother was a witness, Nicole said softly. She couldn't stop the violence. She couldn't achieve justice, but she could refuse to let these people be forgotten. She could make sure that someday someone would know their names and what had been done to them. James understood the profound courage this had required. If Eliza's documentation had been discovered by the wrong people, she would have been killed for it. Simply writing down the truth was an act of dangerous resistance. There's more, Nicole continued. She showed James additional papers from the box. Testimonies Eliza had collected from other survivors, descriptions of white mob violence, names of perpetrators who had never faced consequences. She was building a case, documenting evidence, even though she knew no court would hear it in her lifetime. She was preserving truth for the future. James spent the next hour photographing every document Nicole shared. With her permission, each piece added to a devastating picture of systematic racial terror in Atlanta during the late 1890s. Violence designed to destroy black economic success, black education, black independence, black life itself. But the documents also revealed something else, a community that had refused to be destroyed. Alongside the records of violence, Eliza had documented resistance. She had listed families who had successfully defended their homes, businesses that had persevered despite attacks, children who had continued attending school despite threats, churches that had remained open despite arson attempts. The 1897 family photograph now took on even greater significance. It wasn't just a memorial to Samuel. It was part of Eliza's larger project of documentation and resistance. By creating a family portrait that included her murdered son, as if he were still alive, she was making a powerful statement. You cannot erase us. You cannot make us invisible. You cannot destroy our families or our dignity. The way they're holding themselves in that photograph, Nicole observed, pointing to the image on James's laptop. Look at their posture, their expressions. They're not broken. Even in their grief, even hiding Samuel's death, they're showing strength and unity. James saw it now. Robert's hand on Eliza's shoulder was protective, but also supportive. They were standing together. Eliza's expression, which he had initially read as sadness, also contained defiance. The daughters stood close to their brother, their hands nearly touching him, maintaining connection even in death. This was a family asserting their wholeness in the face of violence that had tried to shatter them. "What happened to the family after 1897?" James asked. Nicole pulled out a family tree she had researched over the years. Robert and Eliza stayed in Atlanta. Robert's carpentry business survived, though he faced constant harassment. The daughters all grew up, married, had children of their own. Margaret, the eldest, became a teacher. Sarah became a seamstress, and later opened her own shop. Robert Jr. worked with his father and eventually took over the carpentry business. She paused at Samuel's name on the tree, where the line ended. Samuel's death changed the family forever, but it didn't destroy them. That's important. The people who killed him wanted to terrorize the entire black community into submission, but the Freemans stayed, they built, they continued. That's resistance too. James had one more question that needed answering. Who had taken the photograph? In an era of strict racial segregation, most white photographers refused to photograph black clients, and black photographers were rare. Someone had helped the Freeman family create this powerful memorial image, and James wanted to know who. He returned to the archives and began searching for Atlanta photographers operating in 1897. It took days of searching through city directories, business records, and newspaper advertisements, but finally he found a possibility. A photographer named William Davis, who had operated a studio on Auburn Avenue in the heart of Atlanta's black business district. Davis appeared in an 1896 city directory as William Davis, photographer, colored. James found a few more references to him in black church bulletins and newspapers, advertisements for family portraits, reasonable rates, dignified service for our community. At the Atlanta History Center, James found a small collection of photographs with Davis's studio stamp on the back. He recognized the style immediately, the same careful composition, the same attention to lighting and dignity that he had seen in the Freeman family portrait. The collection included a ledger from Davis's studio covering the years 1895 to 1899. James carefully turned the fragile pages, looking for any entry from September 1897. There, in neat handwriting, he found it. September 15th, 1897, Freeman family. Memorial portrait. No charge. The words "no charge" were underlined twice. Davis had photographed the family for free, his contribution to their act of memorial and resistance. James found one more document in the collection. A letter from Davis to a colleague, dated October 1897. "I continue to photograph our people despite the dangers. Each portrait I create is an act of preservation. We exist. We matter. We will be remembered. The family I photographed last month, who lost their youngest son to violence, I wanted them to have a record that showed him with them, whole and loved. If my photography can give families that gift, then I am doing the work I was meant to do." Davis understood what he was participating in. He wasn't just providing a commercial service. He was creating historical documentation that countered the erasure black communities faced. Every photograph he took was evidence of black life, black family, black dignity. James wondered what had happened to William Davis. Further research revealed that Davis's studio had operated until 1906, when the Atlanta Race Riot, a massive white mob attack on the black community that killed dozens and destroyed hundreds of black-owned businesses, forced him to close. The studio burned in the violence, and most of Davis's photographic archive was destroyed. But some photographs survived, passed down through families, preserved in churches, tucked into boxes that eventually made their way to archives. The Freeman family portrait was one of them, a testament to Davis's skill and his understanding of photography's power to preserve truth. James contacted the Atlanta History Center and arranged to include information about William Davis in his research. The photographer deserved recognition as part of this story. A man who had used his craft to help families document and resist, who had understood that images could be weapons against forgetting. That evening, James sat in his office at Emory, surrounded by copies of all the documents he had gathered. The photograph that had first caught his attention now sat at the center of a much larger story. A story about a family's grief and resistance, a community's determination to survive and document, a photographer's contribution to historical preservation, and a woman's decades-long project of bearing witness to violence that authorities refused to acknowledge. Samuel Freeman's death was a tragedy, but the way his family had chosen to remember him was an act of profound love and courage. James faced a difficult decision about how to present his research. The story he had uncovered was important. It revealed both the horror of racial violence in the late 19th century and the extraordinary ways black communities had resisted erasure and documented their own histories. But it was also a story about a murdered child, and he needed to handle it with profound respect for Samuel's memory and his family's ongoing grief. He met with Nicole Freeman several times to discuss his plans. She was clear about what she wanted. Tell the truth, all of it. Don't sanitize what happened to Samuel. Don't hide the violence, but also don't let the violence be the only thing people remember. Tell them about Eliza's documentation project. Tell them about my family's strength. Tell them about how we survived. James proposed creating a comprehensive presentation of his findings, an academic article for a historical journal, a public exhibition at the Atlanta History Center, and a series of educational materials for schools. Nicole agreed, with one condition, that Samuel's photograph be presented with proper context, and that her family's story be told in their own words, alongside James's historical analysis. Over the next several months, James worked with the Atlanta History Center to develop an exhibition titled Witness and Resistance: The Freeman Family and the Hidden History of Racial Violence in 1897 Atlanta. The centerpiece was the family photograph, displayed large enough that visitors could see every detail, including Samuel's carefully positioned form among his living family members. The exhibition included Eliza's documentation of 43 murders, her collected testimonies, and her letters to future generations. It featured information about William Davis and his role as a photographer who served the black community. It presented the broader historical context of racial violence in the 1890s South and the ways black communities had resisted and survived. But it also included something else that Nicole had suggested: a memorial wall listing all 43 names from Eliza's documentation, along with any information that could be verified about their lives. For the first time, these victims of racial violence were being publicly acknowledged and mourned. They deserve to be named, Nicole said at the planning meeting. They deserve to be more than statistics. Eliza documented them so they wouldn't be forgotten. Now we're honoring that documentation. The exhibition opened on September 12, 2019, exactly 122 years after Samuel Freeman's death. Nicole and several other Freeman family descendants attended, along with descendants of other families whose loved ones were named on Eliza's list. The Atlanta mayor gave a speech acknowledging the city's history of racial violence and the importance of confronting that history honestly. James presented his research, explaining how a single photograph had led him to uncover this hidden history. He talked about the importance of looking closely at historical images, about understanding that photographs often contained multiple layers of meaning, and about how families had used visual documentation as a form of resistance and preservation. But the most powerful moment came when Nicole stood in front of Samuel's photograph and spoke directly to her ancestor. "Samuel Freeman, we see you. We remember you. We know what happened to you, and we know it was wrong. We know you were innocent. We know you were loved. Your great-great-grandmother made sure we would know your name and your story. And now the world knows too. You're not erased. You're not forgotten. You're still part of our family 122 years later." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. "Perfeito! Vou reescrever os capítulos 9 e 10, com 200 palavras cada." The exhibition generated significant media attention nationally. Journalists wrote about Eliza Freeman's documentation project and how a single photograph had revealed hidden history when examined closely. Other archives began contacting James, asking him to examine their collections of 19th century photographs of black families. Were there other hidden post-mortem images? Other acts of documentation waiting to be uncovered? James began training historians and archivists in the visual analysis techniques he had used. Within 6 months, researchers across the country had identified 17 other similar photographs, memorial images disguised as family portraits, created by black families documenting losses they couldn't safely speak about. One researcher in Mississippi found a photograph from 1899 showing a family with their teenage son positioned suspiciously. Investigation revealed the boy had been lynched for learning to read. His family had created the portrait to document his existence, hiding the truth from authorities who would have destroyed it. Each discovery added to a growing understanding of how black families had used photographers as resistance during extreme violence. James found himself at the center of research into what he termed resistance portraiture, photographs containing hidden meanings and messages. Nicole Freeman became a partner in this expanding research, helping historians connect with descendants. She also began documenting all the people listed on Eliza's record of 43 murders. "My great-great-grandmother started this work," Nicole explained in interviews. "She documented these deaths when no one else would. Now we're finishing what she started, making sure every single person is remembered." 2 years after his discovery, James stood before the Freeman family photograph, now permanently displayed at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Visitors stopped, reading the context, looking closely at Samuel positioned among his family. Many cried. Nicole Freeman had become a frequent speaker at the museum, sharing her family's story. "My family could have been destroyed," she would tell audiences, "but they stayed, they built, they documented, they resisted." James had published a best-selling book, Hidden in Plain Sight: The Freeman Family and the Visual History of Racial Resistance. Schools across the country began using the Freeman photograph in curriculum, teaching students about racial violence and the importance of documentation. Descendants of people named on Eliza's list formed an organization dedicated to memorializing victims of racial violence. Every September 12th, they gathered at a memorial park in Atlanta to read all 43 names. At the second annual gathering, Nicole stood with a reproduction of the 1897 photograph. "This image was created in grief and love. My great-great-grandparents wanted Samuel remembered as part of their family, not defined only by violence." As each name was read, Nicole placed a white rose at the memorial marker. The Freeman family photograph hung in the Smithsonian, but its real home was in the hearts of descendants who now knew their full history. Samuel Freeman was no longer hidden in plain sight. He was visible, acknowledged, mourned, and celebrated, exactly as his family had hoped 122 years earlier.